Welcome back, Hnrs. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom on location in Los Angeles, California, right? Sitting in Los Angeles right now, visiting family and stuff like that, and it is the day of Thanksgiving. And I'm taking some time to sit down and make your flip real quick, right? Big thing about it, though, I want to go ahead and go over a couple of things that are going to be going on in conjunction with this flip, right? I'm going to go ahead and post this bad boy, and after you finish watching it, do me a favor and hop over to Google Classroom, right? Hop over to Google Classroom, and you'll actually see your study guide has been posted there. A couple little key notes and stuff like that about any kind of ideas going into your artwork presentations and how all that's going to work. But the other thing I'm posting is a schedule, so you can know exactly what is going to be due when it's going to be due, right? Okay, and then that way you can be fully prepared, coming back from break, so we can kick some butt, go into like Christmas, enjoy it, and actually have some time to really relax, right? So the big thing about it, though, is, speaking of relaxing, let's try to not keep this flip any longer than it absolutely needs to be, right? Let's try to go ahead and let's try to go ahead and pick up our conversation right where we left it off in class when we were talking about the Black Death Plague, right? AKA the bubonic plague, AKA Yersinia pestis bacteria, AKA whatever you want to call it at this point, right? The big thing we need to talk about, though, is we need to briefly review the stuff that we did actually talk about in class, right? We talked about it a little bit already, how the actual plague is a bacterial infection. It's not a viral one. It's the Yersinia pestis bacteria, a rod-shaped bacteria that had been seen before in history, right? We actually did see the Yersinia pestis bacteria outbreak in the Byzantine, right, underneath the rule of Justinian, right? We talked about that entire idea of how like Theodora ruled for him and stuff like that when he was sick. We then transferred our conversation into talking about why Europe was just like prime and perfect when it comes to being a target for this plague, right? Which will eventually lead to the possibility of 50% of all Europeans dying from this disease, and some historians believe 30% of the world population at the time, right? So going into it, though, let's go ahead and like review a little bit. And one thing that we did talk about is that towns and cities by the mid-1300s were absolutely overcrowded and super nasty and disgusting. Towns had actually gotten to the point where like dead bodies would be discovered 2 weeks after somebody had already died, and you usually only knew someone died in a city because of the smell, right? The other big thing about it as well is the cities have become extremely overcrowded due to the fact that agricultural technology is beginning to actually lessen the need for so many workers on farms, right? Now, granted, just to keep it in your back of your mind, like 85% of people still lived in the outskirts, still lived in the countryside, still were mostly serfs and stuff like that. Well, the population was most serfs. 85% of people weren't serfs. But the thing about that we need to understand, though, is most people still did live outside these cities. However, concentration inside the cities was growing exponentially, right? And also, this entire like disease is not going to stop from the cities themselves, because people will begin to run to the countrysides and then take it out there with them as well. However, this breeding ground of the cities is going to create hot spots for the plague, right? But that agricultural technology like the plow and the mill is going to lead to mass urbanization. And that's going to make some even more gross cities because they didn't have sewage systems, septic systems, and they also had walls that went around the outside of them. So instead of continuing to build out and giving them their people space, they built up. And that's going to actually create a situation of an urbanized city that's going to lead to the spread of the plague very, very quickly. Now, the other thing that we needed to talk about as well that we started talking about in class is how climate change and famine is going to help lead to the spread of the plague even further as well, and how particularly Europeans are going to actually be affected by the plague even harsher than the Eastern kingdoms were. But by the 1300s, the population of Europe was very, very high, and a lot of that actually has to do with this thing known as the medieval warming period that came from right about that 1000 AD to about like 1300, give or take, AD, right? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is that right at the end of that medieval warming period, due to like high crop yields, high crop outputs, and limited scares of famine, there's going to be another climatological shift. Now, some of y'all are immediately going to be like, well, you know, it's Thanksgiving and at our family and blah, 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 and somebody yelled, climate change, brah, and like, so like, look, this might be a topic of discussion at the Thanksgiving table, okay? This is different from the climate change we're currently having now, right? The climate change that occurs normally and naturally, it usually happens with about 0.5 degrees Celsius, right? Which is actually going to be enough to affect crops and prevent them from flowering, and is going to actually be a really big thing that's going to lead to the death of crop yields and death of crop outputs in Europe during the 1300s, and lasting, honestly, all the way up until the 1600s. This time period was known as the Little Ice Age, right? The Little Ice Age literally had a massive dip in these like actual like these like temperatures by about a half a degree Celsius. Now in the modern era, we're experiencing like 1.5 degrees Celsius change, which is like 3 times as worse, right? So the thing that we need to understand though is that because of these climatological shifts, known as the Little Ice Age at the time, it made it so there were like 3 straight years of terrible crop failures caused mostly by excessive rain. So because if it's only about a 0.5 degree Celsius decrease in the actual climatological shift, it's basically just preventing your crops from fruiting and flowering on time when they're supposed to be. It's also killing off some pollinators and actually creating a germination cycle that's going to be either much, much shorter or much, much longer. And so from 1315 to 1317, there was literally a famine known as the famine of 1315 to 1317, or the Great Famine, right? So the famine is actually going to be really, really tough, and it's going to kill as many as 15% of peasants in some English villages, okay? Now, why am I just talking about England? Because that's where we have some data, right? Now, remember, this is still the Middle Ages, so we don't have the world's best data, right? We actually know more about the climate of the Middle Ages than we do about the personal experiences of individuals during this time period due to low literacy. Now, the thing going into it, though, as many as 15% of people in some English villages are going to die, and one consequence of starvation and poverty is susceptibility to disease, right? There is literally statistical studies that actually show the lower below the poverty line you are, the more likely you are to actually get sick, right? Because you don't have access to preventative medicine, and you also don't have access to things that are actually going to keep your diet and or your nutritional value high enough to actually fight off or stave off a disease, right? Because, for example, let's look at Justinian. Justinian, fabulously wealthy, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. My man got like Yersinia pestis plague and didn't die, right? Because he actually had access to actually quality like medical treatment, and he lived, and he did not kill him. Whereas most peasants who get the plague during this time period are going to die, and they're going to be heavily affected due to this entire like famine and starvation, right? Now the big thing about it though as well is, okay, we know that Europe is prime, but now we got to understand where is the plague coming from, right? So the thing that that can actually analyze and we know up front is that Europe is the worst place to get the plague right now because their cities are gross. They have no septic systems. They also are like living on top of each other more so than they ever have before with urbanized like areas. And then we also know as well that this famine is actually creating a place where people are going to get sick and it's going to kill them off a lot faster. But where did it come from? Did the plague pop up in Europe? Did it actually grow from like some other kind of like rodent infestation? But where was it all coming from? Well, the thing about it is we don't really know. Like we don't really know. Historians don't really know exactly where it started specifically. But the first evidence we have of people dying from the plague is going to happen in East Asia, right? It's going to happen in East Asia, and one of the key places that we actually understand where this popped up has been areas like China, right? So the thing about it that when we're getting into this is like historians don't know if it started in modern-day China at all. We actually think that it might have started in this thing known as a plague reservoir right outside of the Caspian Sea near the steppe area of Mongolia, right? But the thing about it, though, when we're talking about this is remember that monsoon marketplace. I won't forget the fact that Fairchild understood the monsoon marketplace very, very well. And she understood that the growth in economics of that area led to the growth of intelligence, right? And so what she's going to see as well, and she's going to be able to understand, is that when economics return to Europe, you're going to see the Renaissance period, right? So the thing about it is like in China during this time period, they were making fabulous amounts of money off that monsoon marketplace and in the Indian Ocean. So since they're making large amounts of money, they have access to people who can read and write. Since they have access to people who can read and write, they're keeping good statistics, right? And one census in a very, very large city in China, Beijing, actually shows that before the plague, their population was 120 million people. Now, after the plague, though, it's going to be 65 million. So as we can tell, one of our earliest pieces of evidence actually shows us that we believe that it might have actually hit East Asia first, right? Now, that plague reservoir, though, let's talk about what that thing is, right? These things exist to this day. A plague reservoir is basically a heavily wooded area where there is limited access to human beings, right? And it's mostly like ruled over by vermin or small rodents and things like that, or like mammals and mammalia, and basically it's unrestricted wilderness, right? Well, there is a large area of unrestricted wilderness right next to the Caspian Sea near Mongolia. And so we believe that we call these places plague reservoirs because literally the bacteria is allowed to kind of exist there and it continues to live and typically only just kills off rodents and other creatures there. However, though, from this plague reservoir, you're going to also see rats, rodent, and vermin. And they're going to start actually piggybacking off of a very large trade route that actually ran, as we know, from these different areas, from East Asia all the way over to Europe, right? The Silk Road. The thing about that you have to understand is why would a trade route attract like rodents and things like that from this plague reservoir from from near the Caspian Sea, because the growth of trade routes is going to be all important. Certain vermin and certain kind of actual, like, not vermin, not necessarily, but certain rats and certain like rodents are going to realize that there are things there that they want to eat and consume. So they're going to follow traders. Traders are going to be the biggest occupation that's responsible for spreading the plague, because the things that they actually have in their caravans, in their packs, on the backs of these camels and stuff like that, they're going to actually be attracting rats. The rats are going to be the ones who carry the actual plague bacteria, and the fleas are going to be the ones most responsible for spreading it. So when we're looking at this, you actually saw early on during the during pre-1300, you saw a lateral movement of the plague. From what we can see from the monsoon marketplace civilizations and the kingdoms that were actually profiting off of that entire area, their written records actually show us that literally the plague popped up, moving right along the Silk Road, right? Now there's an interesting thing about it though, as some of y'all remember, they are like, Mr. Terry, but I thought that the Silk Road stopped right around Constantinople, because that they didn't really have any kind of economic advantageous reason to actually go into Europe itself, because they didn't have enough money to actually participate in this thing. Well, that's a really, really good point, Cameron Ellerbush. I really, really love how you're throwing that out there, right? The Mongols, though, are going to be the big reason why it ends up in Europe, all right? So now the thing about it is, you are right. It would have stopped at Constantinople and probably not have gone much further. But what ended up happening is there was this huge empire of people known as the Mongols, a.k.a. the Golden Horde, right? The Golden Horde is this big area right there, which is actually being led by a very famous leader at the time by the name of Genghis Khan, right? Genghis Khan actually takes it over, and then his son Kublai Khan actually takes it over a little bit later on after his death. The thing about it, though, is that the Mongols were very, very proficient in attacking and taking over large areas of land. Now, one of the biggest attacks that they actually perpetrated is where we believe patient zero for the plague in Europe might have actually popped up. The Mongols were also very famous in certain areas for actually using bio attacks or biological weapons, okay? So they attacked a small city right next to the Black Sea called Kaffa, right? And Kaffa is actually located right there, right? And in 1346, that city was attacked by the Mongols, and the Mongols literally used catapults to throw dead bodies into the city that were stricken with the plague, right? They wanted to clear the city out so they could take it over and then use any of its resources for themselves. But the thing about it is since it was located on the Black Sea, some people are going to run to the ports, and they're going to run away from when the Mongols are attacking. But a body must have actually been thrown into the city, the plague must have been started, and literally one person jumped on a boat and then sailed over to Sicily in 1347, and that plague vessel, bang, starts the spread of the plague in Europe itself. In 1347, when that plague ship actually hit Sicily, because it came from Kaffa after being attacked by the Mongols and having dead bodies hucked into the city, it's going to then begin the spread of the plague throughout the rest of Europe, right? Now, the thing about it is you got to understand one thing real quick. The plague spread fast, right? By 1350, the plague was everywhere. So within 3 years, you've got the plague spreading as far as the middle of Great Britain. You've got it all the way up into Scandinavia, into areas like Norway and modern-day Sweden. You had this one little area that never really got it very bad. It was called Kiev and Rus, but that's because they had walls around their city, and they were like, you're not coming in. And they literally basically broke their entire area off. But really quickly, we've got to understand, why is it spreading so quickly, and how is it spreading? So this is a really, really cool little kind of look into what's known as epidemiology. I really, really think that the study of diseases and how they spread is super, super interesting. Whenever during COVID, I was deep diving into a lot of stuff on how does this stuff spread? How do these spike proteins work? How does it actually affect your epithelial cells and stuff like that? But the thing about it that we need to understand, though, is that the plague is a bacteria. So it spreads a little bit differently, right? Bacteria are larger than viruses, and they exist to get into your body, consume enough energy, and then split, and then continue to do it over and over and over again. Well, the bubonic form of the plague is one way that it was spread, and then there was also the pneumonic form of the plague, right? So the thing about it is most people actually refer to it as the bubonic plague. It's all about talking about how you got it, right? So now when you got bubonic plague, it was always coming from none other than usually a flea, right? 90% of the time whenever you got the bubonic plague, it's because a flea jumped onto you after it was on another person who had the plague, or a rat that had the plague, or maybe some other kind of mammal that had the plague itself, jumped onto you, bit you, and then regurgitated bacteria into your body. So something that you have to understand about fleas is that they actually consume your blood to help fertilize their eggs and keep themselves alive, right? So the thing that's really, really interesting about fleas, though, is that when they would actually bite a rat and then consume some of the Yersinia pestis bacteria in that rat's blood that was carrying the plague itself, the bacteria then begin to double and multiply in size in the flea's throat, creating a small blockage, right? And then what happens is, to clear that blockage out, the flea would then bite you, and they go it'll and then like literally throw up plague bacteria inside of you, right? And you could also end up getting this as well from scratches and bites from rats, even though that was actually pretty kind of rare. And then also handling dead animals that had the plague was actually a way you can get it, which is kind of rare though, right? So actually the last time the plague actually hit somebody in the United States, yes, somebody in the United States recently got the plague a few years back. He actually lived in California. It was because from he handling a dead rabbit that had like the Yersinia pestis bacteria in it. He then goes to the doctor and he's like, I don't feel good. And they're like, yeah, big guy, you have the bubonic plague. Go to CVS, take a Z-Pack, you'll be fine. So like going into it though as well, the other form of the plague that you can get is the pneumonic form of the plague. Now the pneumonic form of the plague is the late stage plague. Now we do believe that as the plague began to spread very, very quickly, by about 1348, 1349, some people were spreading it through droplets in the air, because later, literally what happens to the inside of your chest, your lungs begin to bleed, and then if you like continually cough, like this late stage plague, coughing and sneezing has droplets of blood inside of the stuff that's coming out of your face, and then literally that actually is getting into the air and people are breathing it in, right? That's the pneumonic plague. And if you actually like are wondering like how is that even possible, and why we needed to actually like kind of like stay away from each other a little bit during COVID, literally you got to check this noise out. This is how much stuff comes out of your face whenever you sneeze, and it's coming out at a speed of about 60 miles an hour, right? So during a sneeze, or like projectiling, this is literally your body's response to trying to burst these things out of your body, and look at how far that stuff's going. Now, the range on it's only about 6 feet, but man alive, that's super gross. Let's look at that again real fast. Like, look at how nasty that is. My favorite part is right here, where there's just an extra little bleh. Now, imagine, though, that those droplets of saliva have blood inside of them, and then that blood has, of course, Yersinia pestis bacteria attached to it. Nobody wants that, right? Super, super gross. So going into it, though, as well, what did you look like when you got the plague, right? Everybody needs to know the symptoms of the plague. Now, the symptoms of the plague, typically, whenever you got it, the first one you ever got, which is actually well documented in some pieces of medieval text, is a thing known as a bulbus, right? Now, a bulbus is a swollen lymph gland. Now, really, really quickly, sure, a lot of y'all have been to the doctor before, and the doctor has like felt the underside of your jaw and actually checked a couple of things out underneath your jaw. Well, the thing about it that they're inspecting is your lymph nodes, right? And you have a chain of lymph nodes that run from the underneath your jaw, behind your ears, all the way down the sides of your neck, underneath your underarms, down your sides, into the inside of your thighs, and then all the way into your feet, right? And so like now, these lymph nodes are literally have one key purpose. They're for actually bringing in sicknesses and illnesses, latching onto them so your body can then use its white blood cells and T cells to attack them, right? Well, the thing about it is like if you bring in this bacteria into one area, it's going to begin to double and multiply in size. And it would lead to the growth of these things called a bulbus, which is a really, really large infected lymph node. Real, real gross. And now the only big like response to it in the Middle Ages was to lance it. And lancing is literally when they would cut it open to drain the pus in like bacteria out. But think about it, y'all. If you're a doctor and you're lancing a bulbus and you're literally coming directly in contact with this bacteria, doctors would oftentimes get them as well. Now, another form of the plague or another symptom you could get as well is known as necrotic flesh, right? This was actually at a point when you had what's known as the septicemic form of the plague. Write that down. Septicemic form of the plague. Septicimic. Septicemia, or a septicemic plague, literally made your entire body look super, super, super gross. Because literally what would end up happening is the septicemic form of the plague would actually make the flesh on your body rot off of your bones, right? And it would actually literally like come off like, and I think we looked at a picture of it in class, and someone of y'all shouted like, oh yeah, that's like when you could get frostbite and stuff. Yes, that's another form of necrotized flesh, right? And so like literally what it would look like is you would actually have some really, really gross like skin almost coming off of your body. Where'd you go? I had to leave. There we go. That's the septicemic form of the plague, right? So whenever you had that form of the plague, it was almost 100% mortality rate that you would probably die, because literally it was like gone so much to a point that medicine couldn't help you, and especially in the medieval era. Now, really quick, speaking of medicine, how did people think that they could cure the plague? Well, the thing about it is that y'all seen in pop culture.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, buddy.
Bye, buddy. Hope you find your dad.
Thanks, Mr. Narwhal. Bye.
Is like there's a lot of like different kind of popular medical cures for the plague, right? Every single one of you has seen the new Beauty and the Beast movie, which actually infers that Belle's mom died from the plague, right? But there were a lot of popular medical cures at the time for the plague, including the fact that, yes, doctors wore strange costumes, right? Y'all all know the very, very famous bird mask and bird plague doctor costume, right? The thing about this, though, which is really interesting, is we only have a couple of confirmed, this wasn't a widespread thing. We only have a few or a handful of sources that even tell us that doctors dressed like that. So it's a kind of important to understand that it wasn't super, super widespread, but at the time, it's still really, really interesting, and that image sticks with everybody for the rest of their life, right? Like shoving those herbs and spices and stuff like that into the nose of it so you didn't actually smell everything. Now, going into the next one, also another popular medical cure was bathing in human urine because it was considered to be clean. Another one was rubbing onions and vinegar all over your body was supposed to be a big way to help stave off the plague. Bloodletting, though, was one of the other really, really big ones, okay? So now this becomes common practice from the Middle Ages onward all the way up until the 1600s due to the fact that there was this old school philosopher named Galen from ancient Greece who thought that if you had too much blood in your body, you need to let some of it out because he thought you had 4 fluids that had to work in balance with each other: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And so literally, basically, because of this ancient idea, bloodletting became very popular, and they would use a small key like that to cut open one of your veins and drain blood out of you. Now, remember, though, Yersinia pestis bacteria lives inside of your blood. It's probably not the best idea, right? Did I put bathing in urine on here twice? Yeah, I put bathing in urine twice. Leeching was another big one as well. Rubbing chickens all over your body was a popular medical cure. And my favorite one ever is called unicorn horn. And unicorn horn is literally when they would give you this powder and they would say it's actually made from unicorn horn and the mystic beast that is uncatchable and things like that. But actually, fun fact, we all know unicorns aren't real. Sorry to break some of y'all's hearts. But the other thing that we also need to understand is they actually didn't get it from unicorns. They actually got it from narwhals, which are, of course, whales and stuff like that. You know narwhals, right? Like this guy, Mr. Narwhal. Yeah, I love that movie. Go watch Elf. It's good. So but getting into it though, the big thing about it is a narwhal is a very large whale. They would actually kill those, grind the horns down, which is actually a tooth. It's not even a horn. They would grind those down and then sell it on the market as unicorn horn, right? Now the big thing we need to understand, last but not least, is just the effects of the plague, and we'll move through these pretty quick, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in class. First and foremost, surprisingly enough, you actually saw an upsurge in faith and religion. Okay, so now this says faith in religion, but we're gonna say faith and religion. Surprisingly enough, Christianity grew much more powerful because of the plague, and actually grew very, very large and very, very intense because a lot of Middle Ages citizens begin to actually think that God is punishing them for their wrongdoing, so they actually need to bind to themselves to their faith a little bit more. One of the actual best examples of this are these people called flagellants. Flagellants actually popped up during the plague, and they were these individuals that would walk around cities and actually beat themselves while they prayed, believing that if they beat themselves and hurt themselves, then God would not punish them with the plague because they were inflicting forcible self-penance. When you get back into Mr. Mathern or Mr. Madrano's class, ask them about flagellants. They love to talk about flagellants, right? Now, artistic representation is going to dramatically change as well. Art is going to become obsessed with death and realism. You're going to see a lot of dance macabre pieces, right? Early engravings and things like that are actually going to include images of literally the dead dancing, welcoming in new members into their enclave and stuff like that. I actually have seen one of those original engravings right there. It was in the Rijksmuseum in the Amsterdam, Netherlands. So it's going to become more obsessed with death. The economy, now this is really, really interesting. During the actual plague, the economy was high unemployment and economic stagnation. So the economy took a dip during the plague itself. But after, since there's less people, more specialized crops, more specialized jobs, there's more money in the hands of individuals, the economy actually leapt forward after the plague. Population decrease is also going to be a massive effect of the plague, because we're really going to see the decrease in population of 75 to 200 million people. This right here, y'all, is the death rate, right? The death toll. We think it killed anywhere from 75 million to 200 million people total worldwide. We're not positive, though. So, that's, of course, a big, easy one to understand, though, is that, of course, population went down. The other big one that's going to happen, though, as well, is anti-Semitism. You're going to see the growth in, actual organized dislike and attacking of people of the Jewish faith because it led to an increased persecution of them. Now, why would the plague lead to increased persecution of Jewish people? Reason why is because their communities were not as affected by the plague as harshly because they were segregated away from most medieval cities and most medieval societies. Now, the big thing about it is, leading to this increase, the persecution actually led against the Jewish communities. They accused them of poisoning wells or forcibly actually bringing it over. And the thing about it was, though, is that was not their fault. There is no linkage whatsoever between the Jewish people and the spread of the plague whatsoever, but they were internally blamed by other Europeans because they actually didn't get affected by it as much, right? But ironically enough, you didn't get affected by it as much because you were the ones that segregated them away in the first place, right? But the big thing is that's where we're going to wrap everything up. That is the plague flip for your Thanksgiving break. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.